Welcome to the Business of Government Hour, a conversation about management with a government executive who is changing the way government does business. The Business of Government Hour is produced by the IBM Center for the Business of Government, which was created in 1998 to encourage discussion and research into new approaches to improving government effectiveness. You can find out more about the center by visiting us on the web at businessofgovernment.org. And now, the Business of Government Hour.
Welcome to the Business of Government Hour. I'm Michael Keegan, your host and managing editor of the Business of Government magazine. Today, government IT executives must remain true to their agency's strategic intent while addressing many challenges in the government IT landscape. Among those challenges are constrained budgets, rapid technological advancements, and new government mandates. Like most federal agencies, the Federal Communications Commission has sought to meet these challenges head-on, and to do that requires a strong mission support infrastructure. Specifically, it is an information technology core that supports the FCC's strategic goals while keeping an eye on the improvement of operational efficiencies and smarter resource management. What is the FCC's information technology strategy? How is the FCC keeping apace with transformative IT advances? What is the FCC doing to advance its use of enterprise services and collaborative work options? We will explore these questions and so much more with our very special guest, David Bray, Chief Information Officer at the Federal Communications Commission. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
David, I'd like to kick off our conversation with some context. Would you provide us with a brief overview of the history, mission, and overall size of the U.S. Federal Communications Commission?
Sure. So the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, we were founded in 1934, so we actually just celebrated our 80th anniversary. And our mission is everything involving the public infrastructure involved with communications, so wired or wireless. My own particular role is that of Chief Information Officer, a CIO. And so I came into the role about now 10 months ago, and upon my arrival, sort of listening and learning to people, they had about 9 CIOs in about 8 years. And so there had been a lot of turnover with the team. Not all of them had been permanent. Some had been acting. So the first thing I needed to do was try to listen to the team as well as listen to the 18 different bureaus and offices. The Federal Communications Commission has 18 different bureaus and offices. We're only about 1,750 people. And one of the things I was sort of surprised to discover was that we had 207 different systems for those 1,750 people. So that they often say, like, being a CIO is driving a used car off the lot and eventually stopping it, taking a look at the hood and saying, what did I actually buy? That's what I bought. So where we're going now with that is trying to prioritize which one of those systems we need to adjust and sort of modernize first. Because the other thing I discovered was, and this was done back in 2012, the assessment of those 207 systems, more than 40% of them in 2012 were more than 10 years old. And there's been no new investment in systems since 2012 because we had sequestration. So we can assume by now that number is even higher for the number of systems that are more than 10 years old. And so what I'd like to do and what we're trying to do with the team is we're working to try and identify the different data sources that are in those 207 different systems and have at least one single data mart for the FCC that actually points to where that data is, ideally starts to index it, and maybe long-term pulls that data in and it's actually hosted in the cloud. Because what's really important is actually the data. We can actually do new user interfaces, we can do new code, but really we got to maintain that data because that's actually, that's a lifetime of history for the FCC. And so moving forward, that's our goal of trying to modernize the FCC and how we want to move forward.
Yeah, so that's a good introduction, and you kind of hinted at your specific roles and responsibilities as CIO. Could you give us maybe a high-level overview of what you actually do on a day-to-day basis?
Sure. Probably the initial high-level overview is it's 80% people, 20% technology. Okay. And what I would say is I do 2 things. One, it's digital diplomat. So I work with the 18 different bureaus and offices, try to actually identify where there might be opportunities where they could work together on similar IT efforts, as well as sort of beginning to help them sort of think through what they want to do and how they actually want to use IT to actually advance their mission. I'm a big believer that actually we should set our goals. My goals as CIO and with the team, we have 7 different tracks, and we actually specifically align those tracks to mission outcomes. And so IT is actually an enabler of the mission. The other thing that I do is actually serve as human flak jacket. I've actually told the team that I'm serving in terms of trying to encourage a startup mentality in an 80-year-old organization. And so that means that I have to actually give them the permission to take risk and take on new challenges, because there's no easy manual for some of these things. And where possible, we'll have sort of new experiments, and those experiments might not always turn out well, but we will learn from them and we'll pivot and try new things. And so try to have that sort of lean startup mentality. And so on a daily basis, at any given time, going through the days, it's meeting with people. Basically, my meetings are nonstop from about 9 o'clock in the morning till about 4:30 or 5 when other people go home. Then I'm actually triaging the work that I have, the emails that I have, and actually then eventually closing out the day later that evening.
So, by the way, what's the size of your office's budget, and how many folks do you have working for you?
So when I arrived, we had 35 government FTEs. The team had historically been about 75, 80. And over retirements and attrition of personnel and just other priorities, there was no backfilling of those people that we lost. We've grown that team in the short time I've been there, which has been about 10 months. We're now more about 44, 43 FTEs with a goal of trying to do 10 more and get us on a path of growing to a sustainable number. Because I sense that everyone was sort of fighting fires and actually not having the time to actually pay attention to long-term efforts. Contractor-wise, we've been about 250 contractors, but of course that means we need the government FTEs to actually then sort of work with the contractors and provide government direction. We're growing the contractors. We've probably grown them to now about 300 contractors. So it's sizable, especially when you think about that the FCC, again, is only about 750 people. In terms of budget-wise, we're probably, and this was a new outcome when Chairman Wheeler arrived. So Chairman Wheeler arrived as head of the FCC about a month after I arrived. And one of the things that I met with him was I talked about the state of affairs, what we had with the systems. And the good thing was he comes from venture capital, he comes from an IT background, and so he said, well, we have to have systems that actually work so we can accomplish our mission. And so the charge I've gotten from him, and in true Chairman Wheeler form, is with dispatch to modernize our systems as quickly as possible. And so he was able to increase our budget, and we're probably now, when you think about our overall budget, both in terms of our baseline, it's probably about $56 million, and then we actually have for chairman initiatives above baseline another $15 million.
So regarding your responsibilities and duties, what are your top, say, 3 management challenges that you've faced, and how have you sought to address them?
So the 3 top management challenges I have faced. One, there historically has not been an enterprise view on IT across the FCC. When I arrived, one of the fun questions I said was, where's our plans? And I got crickets, and that makes you go, oh boy, it's good to be a CIO. So what I've been trying to do is work with the 18 different bureaus and offices and say, what are your top priorities? There have been several cases where a bureau and office will come in and they'll have this immediate idea, and it's great, and I actually applaud early adopters, but I'll say, can we spend 30 days just storyboarding these ideas for you? How do you actually intend to use this? What's the long-term longevity? How are you going to sustain it? That will also help us know when we begin to actually do the code and the data, did we actually hit the mark or did we miss it? And so we can make adjustments along the way. And so the need to actually have some sort of enterprise planning function, one of the things we actually stood up was an enterprise planning office within the Office of the CIO. So we can actually work with the different stakeholders. The other challenge I faced was, again, whether through time, attrition, whatever, the IT team was, one, always fighting fires because they were short-staffed, and so they weren't thinking strategically. But then, two, they had lost the ability to feel empowered. They were coming to me for things that probably they didn't need to come to them. Actually, I try to encourage autonomy. And so I've taken that directly on, both in terms of modeling behaviors for the team, as well as trying to bring in other people from the outside to sort of talk about the empower that I want to empower the edge. I'm a big believer that in a changing technology environment, if you try to be top-down, you're going to be out of date real quick. And so I actually try to say to the team, I say, I know I'm going to have blind spots. I know I'm not going to know everything. And so actually I applaud when people come to me and say, you might be missing this. Here might be a better way. Bring data, because the data is helpful. But sort of empowering people to make decisions and actually go forth and actually trying to reward that culture within the FCC IT team. And then the third, I guess the biggest challenge was we're just under-resourced. I mean, not just in terms of IT, the FCC as a whole, and so that's just working very closely with the chairman's office, with the other commissioners, and working with the 18 different bureaus and offices to make sure everything we do is tied to mission, just because we have so many priorities and we do have limited resources. How do we make sure that those priorities are going to the biggest bang for the mission outcome?
Great. So what surprised you most since taking this role?
I came in expecting to be surprised. I think what has surprised me the most is the sense of energy that I'm now getting in return from the team. It's actually, when I initially arrived, the good news was my wife's a nurse practitioner. She works in a hospital. She works odd hours. And so I said up front, I'll probably be working some pretty odd hours for the initial 6 months just because you have to sort of to begin to move things forward, you have to put a lot of energy in to overcome institutional inertia. And now at the 10 months mark, I'm actually getting energy in return from the team, and that's good. And so it really is. I mean, I think we have succeeded so far in creating a startup mentality within the legacy organization.
So, David, what is? I'd like to learn a little bit more about your leadership style and management approach. You've kind of touched on it a little bit, but would you outline some of your key leadership principles and illustrate for us how perhaps you have applied these principles throughout your career?
Sure. So the first thing that I did this with the FCC as soon as I arrived. One of the first team meetings I had with the team was that there's a difference between leadership and management. Management is when we actually operate within the expectations of either our boss, our peers, or our reports. And we all have expectations put upon us, and we actually have to meet those expectations. I mean, if we always did what was not expected of us, or we never met those expectations, people begin to get really disappointed. But leadership is when you intentionally step outside of those expectations. And when you do step outside of those expectations, there's going to be friction. The art of a good leader is being able to manage that friction such that nobody burns out or nobody flames out. And so I tell the team that because I say I'm going to sometimes be a manager where I'm going to actually meet your expectations. I have to meet the expectations of Chairman Wheeler and my peers in the bureaus and offices. But there's also going to be times when I'm going to step outside of those expectations. And you might say, well, why is he doing that? And I'm going to helpfully try and get buy-in. I'm going to try and explain it to you, but we're going to have to manage that. That also explains why I'm there to be their flak jacket, because I want them to be leaders too. And so there are going to be times when they're going to step outside the expectations of someone, and so there's going to be bullets flying, and I'll take them metaphorically because I think I want to encourage that. Because one of the things that the nice thing is, again, with Chairman Wheeler's arrival, his favorite phrase is saying it's how we did it last year is just an excuse for not thinking. Mm-hmm. And so the same thing's true that, obviously there's a lot of institutional history at FCC. We want to respect that. I'm a big believer of listening and learning the narratives. One of the things that's impressed me about the FCC is, unlike other government agencies, the average time a government employee has been at the FCC is 15 and a half years. Wow. Which is extremely impressive. I have people that have been there for 40 years, 50 years. I do have it's a diverse team that has been there for a long time. And so my leadership philosophy is, one, to reward stepping outside of expectations as long as it's measurable. And then two, I'm a big believer about empowering the edge. Mm-hmm. Again, in a constantly changing technology landscape, that if you're trying to rely on top-down or if you think you're going to know everything as CIO, you're probably buying into hubris. The space is just changing so quickly. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that we've also tried to do is, where possible, reach out to non-traditional industry partners. Mm-hmm. Not just the ones inside of D.C. I mean, there's a lot of great ones inside of D.C. that do a great job. But we've also parachuted in individual contractors that may be from Silicon Valley, other parts of the country, and actually invited them to spend, 3 or 4 days a week at the FCC, and then if they want to spend 1 or 2 days off-site, they'll fly back and forth. But just bring in those different mentalities from other parts of the country that are tackling with IT. And it's great because you can be in the middle of a meeting where we're trying to figure out how to modernize the system, and maybe you get the answer, well, it's going to take, several sprints and maybe 9 to 14 months. And somebody else says, well, actually, there's this new startup over here that's got this new technology that if we use it, we might be able to get it done in 3 weeks. Mm-hmm. And you're like, well, let's pursue it and just see if it's possible or not.
What is the FCC's information technology strategy? We will ask David Bray, Chief Information Officer with the Federal Communications Commission, when our conversation continues on the Business of Government Hour. How can DoD improve its acquisition processes? Check out the latest IBM Senate report, 8 Actions to Improve Defense Acquisition. The authors emphasize the urgency of acquisition reform in DoD, given budgetary constraints and security challenges, finding that DoD will need to gain every possible efficiency while resisting the temptation to buy defense on the cheap. This report continues the IBM Center's interest in better understanding and improving the federal government acquisition process. Download your free copy at businessofgovernment.org. Welcome back to the Business of Government Hour. I'm Michael Keegan, your host, and our guest today is David Bray, Chief Information Officer with the Federal Communications Commission. So, David, you've mentioned a little bit about your technology and innovation strategy, but I'd like to delve a little bit more into it. Could you give us a sense of your strategic priorities going forward?
Sure. We actually do have 7 strategic priorities that we actually have blogged about with 3 measurable mission goals. And really that came about of discussions with the 18 different bureaus and offices, as well as with the chairman's office. And one of the first things I did when I arrived was I actually purchased food on my own and said, I'm going to just have an open lunch hour from 11:30 to 1:30. food's going to be provided. If you want to come and just share ideas. And we did it again recently as we actually sort of began to share what we're moving forward on. Again, sort of paid for coffee and donuts and just had the commission meeting room and just had people come. Because I think people, while they may initially come from the food, conversations strike up and you'll learn things that you wouldn't know otherwise through formal meetings. And so our 7 priorities are really focused on, one, prior to my arrival, the FCC apparently didn't really have a really good way to telecommute, which is kind of ironic since we are the Federal Communications Commission. And so with speed, we actually, when I initially went to the team and said, how quickly can we roll out virtual desktop? They said, well, that might take 9 to 12 months. I was like, can we condense it to like 1/3 that? And to their credit, within a very short time, they had done a pilot with our Gettysburg facility and rolled out 100% there. We're now more than 50% of the offices here at FCC. And so we hope to have concluded in another month and a half that finished. But it took them all of probably about, from concept to rollout, less than 5.5 months. It was great to see with speed that they could actually move forward with that. There were some learning experiences along the way. The moment of both happiness and horror for any CIO is when you demo something and the chairman says, I want to be in the beta. And you're like, oh. But to his credit, he was in the beta. He helped provide valuable feedback. We learned from it and we moved forward from it. But that's when you know you have an interesting boss, when he wants to be in the beta himself. So you're like, the second priority that we're also looking at is how can we actually begin to improve our cybersecurity posture? Again, with 207 systems, with more than 40% of them more than 10 years old, that's obviously something that's of concern. And that it's through no fault of our own. They may have been engineered well to begin with, but those are aging technologies. And so we're looking at ways that we can actually secure that and move forward with that as well. And then the third thing we're trying to do is, again, by doing the storyboards, we can begin to identify modules that we can reuse. So a bureau might draw out this workflow of how they might actually do complaint reform, or they might do rulemaking, or they may do licensing. And as they do that, we may actually step back and say, well, look, it looks like a lot of commonality in some of these workflows. One, they got to authenticate the user. I would love to actually have a common way of authenticating the user as opposed to having 207 different ways of authenticating the user. Or export to PDF, or import from this type of database, or provide this export. And so we're moving towards the ability to actually reuse module parts of our architecture internally, but then also expose that through application protocol interfaces, so application programming interfaces, APIs. And by having the APIs exposed, that actually allows us to actually begin to remix also what's available on the outside with our partners, with the public. We actually do have exposed for several of our commission systems already. We've already sort of begun to expose APIs that you can use to pull down commenting on rules, things such as that. The National Broadband Map, there's some things that you can pull down as well. And so I really see that the future of what the FCC becomes in terms of IT is it's more of a data broker. Both in terms of receiving data from the public and our partners, but then also providing it out and sort of serving as that trusted broker on data.
Yeah, so you had mentioned in our previous segment a little bit, you touched on or sort of teed up your IT modernization effort. I'd like you to pursue that a little bit more, and maybe how does the creation of a choice architecture decision-making process factor into this? And could you tell us a little bit more?
Sure. I could, as CIO, issue a memo and sort of say, we're going to start doing these top-down edicts. We're going to argue that, it's more cost-effective to move towards network printers as opposed to local printers. But, I've seen that tried, and it doesn't really work too well. And so what I tried to do when I first arrived was I said, can we get normalized cost estimates as how much it costs to provide a local printer versus a network printer? Can we get cost estimates as how much it provides for different tablets versus desktops? And so we can begin to provide a menu of choices to the bureaus and offices. And so they can choose and say, in my circumstance, I'm okay with network printers because we're all in the same location, it makes sense. Or maybe I'm in the field and I actually do need that local printer because the reality is it's only 3 of us and, we're out in the field. But they can choose that. The same is true with as we move forward with modernizing. I fully expect that probably in about 2 or 3 years from now, we may or may not do another refresh of our desktops. We may be moving more to laptops and tablets. And so, again, providing them that choice, virtual desktop allows them to work wherever they want to work, on any device that they want to work, and sort of exploring that flexibility. But the other thing is also thinking about when we actually sort of map out those workflows. I'm sure it's not a surprise to any CIO when you hear that everyone says that their system is different, and here's why. And that's partly why I go back to the storyboard, which is, okay, well, you can be in the driver's seat for how you actually want to change your business. The other thing with storyboards that's also useful is oftentimes people approach it as if the way they solved the problem last year, or in some respects 10 years ago. And they say, well, it used to be a paper-based process where we mailed out the forms, we got the forms back, we scanned them, then we actually dealt with them. And while we're still thinking about using the web, we're going to use the same process. And you're like, well, maybe there's some shortcuts you can do now. And so by storyboarding, it puts them in the driver's seat. It gets them to buy into it. And then we can say to them, well, if you reuse these modules we've already written for these other Bureau efforts, you'll get it in half the time at a cheaper price. But it's up to you, because you may be able to say, well, no, this module really is unique, and here's why. And it's like, okay, that's your choice, but it's going to either take a longer period of time, and it may also cost more money. But it's me as the CIO being that broker to that conversation versus assuming that I know exactly what's right for the 207 different systems, which I don't have the number of hours in the days to do that, but actually allowing the Bureau and offices to actually have the autonomy to actually figure out what's best for them.
But I was just wondering, you had mentioned a little bit about the entrepreneurs, correct? And I'd like to switch gears there and go, the innovation aspect of that. Some folks may mention that it's a customer service-oriented approach, but I think when I was researching for this, it seems a little bit more than that. And could you tell us a little bit more about this initiative? How are you empowering these folks to work with the bureaus and offices to get their IT needs done within a limited budget? And more importantly, what prompted you to go in this direction?
So maybe I'll start with the second part of your question first, which is how did I sort of get to that position? Back in 2004, I had been IT chief for the Bioterrorism Preparedness Response Program. And with the Bioterrorism Preparedness Response Program, I actually started with it in 2000. There was always a tension between the enterprise view of the Center for Disease Control and the needs of the program. And in the enterprise view, obviously wanted to do a waterfall approach. They had a 3 to 5 year plan. And I used to, and somewhat tongue-in-cheek, I used to say, well, we don't have an agreement with the bioterrorists not to strike until we're done with our IT systems. They will not operate on that timetable. And so I at least had experienced that. And then later in 2004, I got offered the opportunity to also be Director of Informatics for HIV/AIDS at the Center for Disease Control. And that was the division of HIV/AIDS, which had historically 10 different branches that also had not really worked together well. There was not a good enterprise view. And I was given the choice between, do I create my own IT shop that then works with them? And I said, well, no, actually, I'd prefer to embed them. Partly because I just figured if it's another shop, it's going to become another silo. I'm a big believer, if you look at history, the thing that's great about the United States is we had fought a revolution, and that the Federalist Papers number 51 said they wanted ambition to counter ambition. That was going to be the checks and balances. And so I think actually, people lament that bureaucracy somehow is slow or has cylinders of excellence or silos. That's actually intentional. It prevents any one person from getting too much power. But that said, if you want to actually move forward and make change, if you yourself become a cylinder, it's not going to work. And so you got to do a network model, which is great. It's actually what CIOs should be doing because we get networks, but oftentimes we forget the human network aspect. And the value of face-to-face. And so I went in this direction when I arrived at this. So I did that at the Division of HIV/AIDS in 2004. It was interesting. 8 of the bureaus and offices bought into it. 2 of them were kind of resistant. In fact, they were very vocal of, well, we'd prefer to have epidemiologists. Why are you giving us an IT person? I'm like, you'll get your epidemiologist, but we need to have an IT person that's working with you to understand the context in which you operate, sort of translate. And actually, some of the people I ended up hiring were actually anthropologists, and sort of embedding in the bureau and office. It got to be so interesting because, of course, in government, there's some interesting personalities. Someone actually did a Freedom of Information Act, a FOIA request on my resume because they didn't think I was old enough to be qualified for the job I was in. I was like, no problem. Here's my resume. That's fine. But a year into it, actually, one of the biggest resistors came back later and said this was the best thing that ever happened to their branch. And so that, to me, actually showed that while there was resistance, once you get over that hump, then it was actually accepted. And so I think that's, again, the role of leader is sometimes you're going to step outside of expectations. You got to manage that friction. So when I arrived at the FCC and saw sort of the same situation of 18 different bureaus and offices that hadn't been used to working together as an enterprise, to be honest, it may have been the case where whoever shouted the loudest got what they wanted. I knew I had to do something different. And also I wanted to empower. I intentionally did want to empower the bureaus and offices because I didn't have, with 35 people, enough people to actually understand the whole breadth of the 207 different systems. And so by going this path of having entrepreneurs, it was a way of having the bureaus and offices have buy-in and actually have, the direction to shape where they wanted to go. But it was also when I wanted to try and hire people, I could actually tout that I will give you autonomy. I want talented people. It doesn't have to always be chain of command. You can actually try new things out. Because I'm a big believer that there's really 3 things that'll make someone work for something regardless of how much you actually are paid. And those 3 things being, 1, if you give them a sense of autonomy. 2, if you give them the ability to see measurable progress on whatever they're working on. And then the third thing, and this is something we have in spades in public service, hard missions that are important. And that's just in the purpose. And so it's sort of a rallying call. And it's also a chance to actually sort of step back have talented people. I'm a big believer that A people hire A people. If you have A people, set them forth and see what they can do. Give them boundary conditions so that, say if you hit against this boundary, come back to me and we can have a conversation and figure whether or not we expand that boundary or if we stay in it. But otherwise, it's up to you as to how you want to get from point A to point F, and you can figure out A, B, C, D, E, F. That was a bit of a shift, though, for the team, because they initially wanted me to give them, explicit guidance. And I was like, that's not what I should be doing as Chief Information Officer. I mean, if I'm laying out the specifics of code, I could do that. I used to do that. I'm just an overpaid programmer. Same thing with other things as well. And that it also helps the team remind themselves as to what's really important is being creative problem solvers to the mission. And so that creates a sense of energy because they do actually work across the entire FCC, and it creates a sense of smile. We're building relationships, and to me that's really fun when you get out of bed and you actually just realize you now have people that actually are they see basically anything is possible with how we get out of having these 207 different systems that are very old, and that no idea is too crazy to consider.
I'd like to explore a little bit your efforts to facilitate and improve secure employee telework and mobility at FCC. What are you doing in this area? And you had mentioned briefly the virtual desktop infrastructure effort. As you pursue that and expand it, how does that lead to a bring your own device policy?
Right. So with the Federal Communications Commission, again, not having the ability to telework well gave us an opportunity that we could actually sort of fill that void with speed. And so with Virtual Desktop, we rolled out a VMware product. And so that allows your desktop to show up on your desktop at work, but you could also use it from home. You can use it on a tablet, whether it be an FCC-issued tablet or not. You could use it on your phone in theory, but a Windows desktop on a phone is kind of hard to read. And the good thing is, at the FCC, we are actually required to actually provide wireless in the building, and because that's part of when people come to visit in the commission. Now, that is wireless that's not just for FCC employee use. It's actually for the public's use when they actually have the meetings at the FCC. And so in some respects, it's more like the Starbucks model, which is it's open and you trust the internet at your own risk. But that said, what we are doing with secure virtual desktop is it's a kernel, and so it's a secure kernel that's actually pointing back to us. And so regardless of whether you trust that connection or not, it's establishing a secure kernel to the FCC. And so what we're interested in as we begin to extend this model going forward is, are there other things we can do in that kernel that would give us, a surety that only the things that are meant to be in that kernel are there, nothing's leaving that kernel. We also have the ability to collapse the kernel if somehow you say my device got stolen, it's missing, and so we can actually remove the data. And so it also helps us from a security standpoint because now I don't have 750 different desktops that are all vulnerable points. I really have an image of a desktop that is self-contained, again, within that kernel, that I have to focus on that image being secure, but not the 750 different desktops.
How is the FCC keeping a pace with transformative IT advances? We will ask David Bray, Chief Information Officer with the Federal Communications Commission, when our conversation continues on the Business of Government Hour. Government leaders and managers face major challenges today, including fiscal austerity, citizen expectation, the pace of technology and innovation, and a new role for governance. These challenges influence how government executives lead today, but more importantly, how they can be prepared for tomorrow. The IBM Center report, 6 Trends Driving Change in Government, offers a path forward for government executives responding to the ever-increasing complexity and challenges they face today. Download your free copy at businessofgovernment.org. Welcome back to the Business of Government Hour. I'm Michael Keegan, your host, and our guest today is David Bray, Chief Information Officer with the Federal Communications Commission. So, David, what are you doing? And you had mentioned earlier that one of your roles is as a flapjacket and protecting your staff or giving them leeway to be not as risk averse as much of government. So what I want to get is, how are you cultivating a risk tolerant environment that fosters innovation within your agency as respects technology and innovation?
So it's interesting to think about how risk adverse we, the public, have become. In 1908, a young ensign by the name of Vincent Nimitz ran his boat, the USS Decatur, aground in the Philippines. It was a U.S. boat. He ran a boat, and he was court-martialed but not drummed out of the Navy and assigned to submarines. And about 35 years later, became a 5-star admiral in charge of the Pacific Fleet and helped us win World War II. Imagine if that had happened nowadays, that, it wouldn't have been an ensign, but maybe a lieutenant commander runs his boat aground in the Philippines. Not only would there be pundits on television, they would be on Twitter, fire Nimitz, but his boss and his boss's boss would probably be called, before Congress, and so we've become, while at the same time we have this sort of deluge of information and we've become more transparent, we've also become more risk-averse. And so that's an interesting tension, because I do want people to take risk, and so I have to sort of model that behavior. And so one of the things that I did when I first arrived, and it seems so simple, but I said I'd like to have a Twitter account. And they said, well, we've never had a Twitter account for the CIO before. And I was like, well, it's social media and everything like that. But I intentionally wanted one that was FCC_CIO. And the reason why was, one, to sort of hear what's going on. But then two, I'm a big believer if the only time people hear about IT at the FCC is when something's gone wrong, then they're going to think that's the only thing we're doing. And the reality is we're trying to do a lot of great things, and we do have some stories to be shared. And so part of it was to actually begin to share that message, begin that network, so that people can understand if we take a risk, and that risk turns out that it was 80% likely to succeed, 20% not, and unfortunately the 20% happened. They can at least understand in the context of this was a calculated portfolio of bets where maybe 6 things turned out well and the 7th thing didn't. And that's been an interesting culture shift. And the good news is I've seen other CIOs in public service also step up to the plate. Recently, General Services Administration, GSA, created GSA_CIO, which I had to smile because theirs is in all caps. Mine's in lowercase, but anyway. So I'm hoping that will allow more of the conversation of what we're doing. But it also serves for me as a learning mechanism because, again, the world is changing so quickly. That I can't necessarily know everything, but I can be open to the network sort of saying, here are things that you might want to consider. And so the other thing that I've done is we started blogging about what we're doing. So we blogged about our 7 tracks and the 3 measurable goals that we're working on to try and modernize the FCC. We also shared that storyboard. One of the offices, it was the second day, came in, and I won't say the name of the product, but they said, we want X. And I said, why? And they said, well, it just came out. And I said, well, could you tell me a little bit more? And so we storyboarded it. And we actually are now sharing it with industry consortiums. We also put it on our blog site so that it's available to everybody to actually comment and actually say, here's what we want to do. It's involving mobility. It's involving the field. We actually want to do telecommunications from different sites. We also want to do it securely. We want to do it in areas where maybe getting a cell signal might be really difficult, and doing a satellite might be too much latency. And so sort of just trying to figure out what's possible and just sort of see what industry says is possible, what the public says is possible. And so having that conversation, I think that helps me encourage people to take risk and actually be open to the fact that we need to experiment with other things. The other thing that I also held forward when I arrived, it turned out to be an interesting experiment that went quite well. About 5 months ago, we launched what was called the FCC Speed Test app. And this was basically a very simple app that's available. It was initially available on the Google Play Store. It's also available on iOS Store. It will test your internet connection 3 times a day, give you results, share that results with a third party, and that third party shares it with the FCC. And then the FCC turns around and makes that data available for download by the public. They can actually analyze it itself to produce the first crowdsourced map by a provider of connection speeds across the country. The code is also available on GitHub, and so if people want to fork it or actually modify the code to do other things, they can. They can also make sure that it truly is treating their information as anonymous. We don't know who you are within a 5-mile radius. We don't capture your IP address, so we do protect your privacy. Now, we thought maybe 10,000 people might actually be using it. Turned out we had more than 50,000 people using it. It continues to grow. The other thing that's interesting is it was the number 4 app for a while on the iOS store, right behind Google Chrome. And so that to me points to a model of where in the past, DC in particular, we thought about, DC is where government happens, and it's something that government workers do, maybe working with contractors. We're like, well, no, maybe we can actually engage the public directly with their consent, and they can actually be a part of the sort of monitoring, part of the solution of providing information. That to me is exciting because when you think about cell phones, your smartphone, apparently the statistic is your modern-day smartphone now has as much computing power that President Reagan had back in the 1980s available to him as president. And so when you think about that sort of change-up, and the fact that that's now available, apparently the next 1 billion smartphone users who are new will get their smartphone for $20 or less. It's mainly in developing nations. And so how do we think about how does that change how we do representative democracy? And how do we engage the public as sort of not just sort of passive watchers of what's going on in D.C. or wherever it is and around the world, but actually participants in the actual process of informing and actually being a democratic nation. That, to me, is extremely exciting.
And in all of this, you have to make sure the environment in which you're operating in is secure and safe. Mm-hmm. And so that transitions to, what are you doing to strengthen the FCC's IT security posture? And I'd be interested to understand a little bit more about your view of cybersecurity and culture and how they intertwine.
So at the FCC, for our internal cybersecurity, of course, we had perimeter defense. We actually, today's world, you can't just do that. You always have to have defense in depth. And so it's not just about instrumenting your network to let you know what's going on in your network, that you may have some privacy, as well as monitoring what's going out, because in several times what's going out might be a signal. What we're trying to do is, when we write updated code for our modernization effort with the different IT systems, can we actually say, here's how we think the code should behave? And if it doesn't behave this way, send an alert. Mm-hmm. Now, that might be that it's not a cybersecurity event. It might just be, again, the hardware fault, software bug. But it could also be that someone's trying to do something with the code that was not intended. And so, again, by going back again to those initial storyboards, if we can actually say, here's how things should operate, we can then say how things shouldn't operate and sound an alert so that a human can pay attention to it. Because the other thing that's also what keeps me up at night, you can't have everything be a human-centric process. You need to have the machines tip and cue the human to pay attention to it. And so my view on culture in cybersecurity is, we've gone from an era in which we tried to apply it where if there was just enough information provided to humans, we could secure everything. And I think we need to actually invert that to, we know 2013 there were 7 billion network devices on the face of the planet. All estimates point to that before the end of 2015 there'll be 14 billion network devices on the face of the planet, so twice the number of humans on the planet. But then if you carry that forward, by 2020, anywhere between 50 to 75 billion or more network devices on the face of the planet, you have to start relying on algorithms more, which creates an interesting conundrum, because, again, how do you trust the algorithm to begin with as well? But, again, if we can at least say, here's what we think the algorithm should do, and if it doesn't do that, sound an alert that someone can pay attention to it. It may be, again, hardware fault or software bug, but that actually tips and cues the humans as to what they need to pay attention to, and moves us forward from the era of which we were trying to have everything just be a human problem that if they focus on it and they had enough data they could do it, to how the machines can actually cue us to what we should pay attention to and help secure things moving forward.
David, you have a vision of positioning the FCC to become a trusted broker of data. To that end, what are you doing to transform the accessibility to FCC data? And what are some of the obstacles you may face in trying to realize this vision?
Yeah, so accessibility is extremely important. And one of the things that we've discovered is we probably need to do some improvements on our 508 compliance. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. And in fact, one of the great entrepreneurs that we have at the FCC, her name is Teresa Shea. She's actually on detail to us from NIH. She lost her sight when she was in her 20s. But if you meet her, one, she's very passionate about how IT isn't just about making things 508 compliance for the sake of 508 compliance. It's actually about, if you make something that's machine readable, it actually can be then consumed by things like the Suris of the world, or the Google Nows of the world, or the Katanas of the world. And I think this is key because, again, we're moving from an era in which there's just this huge data explosion. I think the estimates are that by 2022 we'll have more digital information on the planet than what all our eyes see in the course of a year, which is just staggering. So if you can make it so it's machine readable, it doesn't just benefit those individuals that actually may need different ways of accessing the information because of their abilities, but it also then allows the machines to actually make sense of it too. The other thing we're trying to do is we're a big supporter of, again, sort of exposing those application programming interfaces, those APIs. And so I've said going forward, any effort we do to modernize will expose APIs. They will be well documented. And so by having those APIs exposed, we allow for surprises when people may actually sort of pull down our data, mix it in interesting ways, and actually reach interesting things that may inform telecommunications that we ourselves just didn't have the staff to do or have the time to do. And I think that's important, again, to represent democracy. The last thing that we're also trying to do, we are intentionally launching the ability to actually engage both internal stakeholders and external stakeholders to actually give their input. I think the interesting thing about the FCC is it really is a business-to-business. While engaging the public is important, and we hope to do it for APIs, maybe about 85% of what the FCC does really is with different parties, both nonprofits and for-profits. By getting those inputs and those requirements up front, and again, sort of following that same storyboard mold, we will identify the parts of both the old transition.fcc.gov website and the new part, so that together going forward, we can actually sort of amplify those parts. We definitely need to have the site be responsive. Again, we have the FCC. It should show up good on a tablet and a smartphone, and have it be machine readable at the same time too.
Yeah, and I was wondering with the website itself, what do you doing, or how are you using the web to execute parts of the chairman's process reform?
Right.
Tell us a little about that.
Yep. So with the process reform, there are a couple of priorities that deeply involve the web. The most prominent one is with complaint reform. With complaint reform, FCC has historically had a process that involved paper forms. And you may call in or write in with a complaint. The forms would be mailed to you. You then mail back the relevant form that was appropriate to your complaint. And from then it would be scanned and actually put in the system. And so what we want to do there is actually move towards a model where ideally it's a web-first approach, where you can come in and say, here's the nature of my complaint. And it actually works you towards sort of like a decision tree that actually says, well, here's the right, and we can even present the right form so you can fill it right there on the spot, form to help solve your problem. Or it might be the case that actually this is not something the Federal Communications Commission can do, but maybe it's our partners with the Federal Trade Commission or another part of the government agency, so you don't even sort of spend too much time and energy in what's actually the wrong place and we'll redirect you elsewhere. With the web-first approach, we do need to recognize that there's still cases where people won't be able to use the web for whatever reason. And so we'll have to support the ability to actually have things come in through telephone calls. Ideally, we'll get out of the business doing paper, but there may be some exceptions where we have to do that. But it's a web-first approach. And then you can sort of, again, sort of using like the model of Amazon or UPS, you can actually track the status of your complaint. You can see where it's at. And equally, we can provide an aggregate assessment to the public as well as to our partners to say, here's the number of complaints we're receiving of this type or associated with this type of provider. And so you can actually see that publicly. You may not be able to drill down to specifics because there may be personal identifiable information with the individual complaint, but you can at least see what's the different volume and see the things that are happening there. The other thing that we've also been talking about is there's the electronic commenting filing system, which obviously has gotten a lot of popularity lately at the FCC. And so with that, we've talked about, can we provide the ability so you can actually see the number of comments that are coming in on a regular basis. We've also talked with the Bureau and actually asked them, how do you want to make sense of the different comments that are coming in? Because it's right now free text, and free text says, might be a bit challenging to actually make sense of, but it's something that I think that the public would want. We do allow people to web scrape, which basically means download from the electronic commenting filing systems all the comments that have been provided, which, interesting enough, I think when we recently had an interesting sketch that highlighted the attention of the FCC with the electronic commenting filing system, we had people that are logging comments, and then a split second later we're actually querying for the exact comment they just submitted, which created an interesting index demand on the commenting filing system as a whole. But we do support, and actually, believe it or not, when that event happened, we had 26 gigabytes of text information downloaded from the FCC's commenting filing system in less than 24 hours. So the good news is the public likes to engage us, particularly on issue. I mean, who would have thought 10 years ago that, there would have been this demand? But the good news is we just need to modernize our systems to actually have that robust public facing. The other thing that I've also thought about is not just for the public, but also for our partners that engage us. Can they have sort of personalized dashboards so that they don't have to look through 207 different FCC systems to find the information associated with them? They can actually see a dashboard and say, show me everything associated with the different licenses I associate with television stations, radio stations, satellites, and they can actually see the different assets they have as opposed to actually having to query different systems. And so as we move forward and do a data mart, that'll make it much easier for both FCC internally to have that data, but then also expose that to the public appropriately as well.
So, David, given the mission of your agency, there's a perception that's sort of internally lagging behind in innovations and the adoption thereof. How are you trying to transform that perception and actually make it a reality that you're going to be a leader in this area?
Right. You're right about the perception. And actually, I have a theory that organizations often do well externally what they do poorly internally because they put their good people on the outside. And so the FCC was great with the advances of the Internet in the 1990s. They sort of forgot to incorporate themselves in doing that. And so the way we'll sort of move that forward is by having a series of demonstratable wins, and we're really just starting that adventure. Again, the first 10 months that I've been here, it really has been focusing more on let's get virtual desktop out, let's make sure we're actually building those relationships, let's make sure we're getting those inputs so it's not me assuming I know what's right, but actually we're working with bureaus and offices to understand that. But I hope over the next course of the next year, we'll have demonstratable sort of modular successes that move us forward, that the public can see, that our partners can see. We obviously have a lot to do with the FCC website, that we can actually get that input so that people can actually see that they're actually getting input into it. I do think, again, with virtual desktop and doing bring your own device to work, that may not be progressive for the private sector, but for public sector, that's still a big leap forward. Thinking about if we can use Box.com for our sort of cloud storage, that's also a step forward. So it's probably going to be, the best word to say is, we won't do disruptions because that's too big, but we'll do a series of interruptions that begin to actually change how we've been perceived in the past of lagging behind, hopefully be going forward. And it's going to be a network effect. It's not just going to be me. It's going to be the entire network of the FCC doing it.
What does the future hold for information technology within the Federal Communications Commission? We will ask its CIO, David Bray, when our conversation continues on the Business of Government Hour. In a world inundated with all kinds of information, timely, relevant, and more predictive data can drive better decision-making. Law enforcement agencies are at the forefront in leveraging data and using innovative software to generate predictions that help police prevent crime. What is predictive policing? How can using analytics make us safer? Check out the IBM Center report, Predictive Policing, Preventing Crime with Data and Analytics by Jen Bachner, and find out. Download your free copy at businessofgovernment.org. What do agency leaders need to know about the federal acquisition process? What are some of the key federal procurement trends? And how can agency leaders overcome today's acquisition challenges? Check out the new Center report, A Guide for Agency Leaders on Federal Acquisition by Trevor Brown, and find out. The report offers practical recommendations for improving federal acquisition. Download your free copy of A Guide for Agency Leaders on Federal Acquisition at businessofgovernment.org and find out how the business of government is not business as usual. Welcome back to the Business of Government Hour. I'm Michael Keegan, your host, and our guest today is David Bray, Chief Information Officer with the Federal Communications Commission. So, David, given the role information technology plays in mission delivery and program performance, how has the role of the Chief Information Officer evolved to become more than just a mission support person, but a trusted advisor?
At the FCC, I say, because oftentimes I may get asked policy questions and I have to step back and say, I just do IT. But then when I say I just do IT, then the question is usually well, what nowadays does not involve IT? And I think that's the world we've come in, and that technology has become ubiquitous. And so the role of the Chief Information Officer can't be seen as just doing IT support and keeping the engines running. We often need to think about how best we actually use that technology to accomplish the mission of the organization, both in terms of the here and now, but also having a strategy and a vision for where we want to go. And so the joy that I've been having at the FCC, aside from dealing with in some respects, I actually like parachuting into situations where I'm the underdog and we have outdated systems, because clearly what we've been doing hasn't been working so far, and so we can challenge the status quo. But the other joy I've been having is actually been working with the chairman's office, with the managing director, to actually say, well, what's our 3 to 5 year plan, and actually sort of map that plan going forward. And to have a CIO involved in that conversation is fun, because technology will be embedded in everything we do nowadays going forward. And I think that also helps you, because sometimes policy or laws are crafted and then the implementation is thought through, and then they say, okay, technology people, now make this happen. And you're like, wait. How did we get to this path where we're now doing this approach when we could have done this approach, which would have been a whole lot easier? And so having that conversation. The other thing is, I think CIOs everywhere, both in the public sector and in the private sector, need to be more outwardly focused, because the lines are getting blurred as to what's inside your organization, what's not inside your organization, both in terms of technology, but also just in terms of getting things done. I think the interesting trend that will accelerate is, the example of the FCC speed test app being one, is it's not something that's done solely by government workers. It's not even something that's solely done by public-private partnerships. It's actually something that's being done directly by the public. And so that's why I like to use the word public service, because I think public service involves, and increasingly involves, not just government, not just public-private partnerships, but also the public actually playing an active role and actually being not just a observer and a watcher, but they can actually be an active participant in the process. And so I think for a CIO, you need to be thinking about, how are you doing things outwardly? How are you engaging that network? How are you learning from that network? And how are you looking for opportunities to actually do things that you don't have to do just in your organization itself?
Well, maybe a little bit outside your particular role, but something that maybe dovetails with your expertise. What emerging technologies hold the promise for improving the work you do, and maybe beyond what you do, what the whole of the federal government does?
The one technology I would point to that I hold a lot of hope for is algorithms. And let me step back a little bit and say what I mean by algorithms. In 2012, the Hewlett Foundation apparently had a competition to see if anyone could write a algorithm that would grade a third grade essay as well as a school teacher. And for $60,000, apparently someone actually won that competition by writing an algorithm that actually would find the same grammar problems that a third grade teacher would find. A year later, apparently Xerox actually produced a copier where you can actually take a handwritten test, put it on the copier, it will scan the tests, scan the questions and the answers, and actually grade it for the teacher. Now, in public service, we have opportunities where we do job classification, which is a fairly intensive human process. I'd love to be able to turn to the computer and say, based on the database you have of different job postings that are acceptable, can you compose to me the following job posting that will have the following skills for these individuals and classify it as appropriate, and then, show me the example, and then advertise it, and 2 weeks later, select from the people that actually have applied, give me the top 5 candidates so I can then meet with them. And so can we actually have the machine help us do that as opposed to what right now is a somewhat of a magic art sort of esoteric approach to, the people who do classifications do it very seriously, but it's something that I think would be interesting to actually have an algorithm do it. The other example I'd point to is requests for proposals. The same thing. I'd love to be able to say to the machine, I'm looking for an RFP that will have these following things be competed for. Can you compose the RFP for me? Make sure it checks all the bounds, the FAR as appropriate. Advertise it. And then give me the top 5 people that have actually applied, or give me, that we can go from there. The interesting thing with that, and the example that I like to hold up is, back when the U-2 spy planes RFP went out, it was only 2 pages. So, sort of that same model, how can I get back to doing things with a 2-page RFP as opposed to a 200 or 300-page RFP?
So, David, as you, transition to the future a little bit, what are some of the major opportunities and potential challenges your organizations will face in the next coming few years, and how do you envision your office will evolve to meet those challenges and seize those opportunities?
I think the opportunity and challenge is so millennials will not be wedded to a single job in a single place. So the FCC model where people have been there for more than 15.5 years on average, that we have people, I have people on my staff right now that have been there for 40, 42, even 50 years. I don't think you're going to see that with the same generation that we have with the millennials, and then Gen Z, when Gen Z comes after millennials, which apparently is a generation that has never known the world without the internet. Instead, they may move from job to job. Even in my own career, I've probably changed within public service and also with the private sector. I've changed jobs generally about 3 or 4 years. They've all been around a common theme, so we've been loyal to a almost like profession, but not to a specific organization. I think that actually makes us more diverse in our ideas and actually allows for cross-pollination. But I think that's a challenge because you don't want to have that talent necessarily disappear with all the ideas and the momentum that you had. And so I think technology may be an interesting way to sort of take that on because, again, if the world is getting blurred, we can do things like Challengegov for public service. We can do things like maybe a Kickstarter for interesting ideas. And so you can actually tap into expertise that's not always in your organization. We are doing something, and we plan to launch a more formal event later. We may call it the FCC Ambassadors Program, where we are trying to get people on short 6 to 12 month engagements that are coming in from Silicon Valley, from other parts of the country, just to bring in those ideas and actually infuse those ideas going forward, and recognizing that it's term limited. And so it can be focused on a specific outcome, and then they can go elsewhere. I'm interested when we start to see, and I know that the General Services Administration started this experiment, when people in government aren't just doing 100% for one organization. I think there was recently, they were looking for someone that would do a 20% time and then 80% time somewhere else. And so when we start doing that, that's an interesting shift for public service because right now you have HR departments for each of the different organizations that you're with. Maybe we need it that you come in and you say, okay, congratulations, you're now with federal public service. You can move around, mobile-wise around that. And actually, if there's an interesting problem that you can actually, quote-unquote, bill your hours to, even though you are a government employee, then that's great. If it gets to be 3 or 6 months and you're not able to sort of have those billable hours, then we're going to have a conversation of, is this really working out? In some respects, it's shifting more towards bring the right skills to the right problem, which then points to how technology is going to need us to actually identify who's those right people. That the machine says, I see you're trying to solve a problem like this. Let me give you the top 10 names of interesting people in this space, and you might want to actually see if you can bring them onto your team. And maybe the team's only going to work for 3 or 4 months on that problem and then dissolve. But I think that's the world we're going into because things are so emergent more and more that we can't do formal organizational structures just because they would be too slow. And then you always have the trouble of organizations often don't know when they need to change or morph. where this way you could actually impose them going forward.
It's interesting when you describe that. It's almost like you have a consultancy apparatus or approach, and then you have the jointness from the DoD side.
Yes.
And so with that as a backdrop, and it's a very interesting way to look at the generations. What advice would you give someone who is thinking about a career in public service?
I would say we're looking for creative problem solvers, first and foremost. And so that means you need to have really sort of three skills. The ability to characterize what the problem is, because if you can't define what the problem is, then you can't even begin to solve it. But then you need to be able to implement on it. So it's more than just sort of like the McKinsey and the Bains of the world, which are really good at characterizing problems and making recommendations and then moving on to the next one. You then actually have to deliver. And that's hard, because that's the messy art of involving with humans. You know, I often joke, if you want a perfect system, get rid of all the humans. But humans are beautiful and wonderful. One of the things I have on my door, my father gave me a poem when I was 20, and I've had it in my pocket ever since. It's the poem If by Rudyard Kipling. And the opening line, which is, if you can keep your head about you when all are losing theirs and blaming it on you, that is public service. But that's wonderful, because we do wonderful things here. Now, we do some things that are not less than great, and we learn from them. But on the less than great point, I would also point to another poem, if I could, E. Cummings, which says, "Oh, humanity, how I love you. You are always forgetting you have the secret of meaning of life in your back pocket and sitting down on top of it." That's human nature. It's not... One of the things I like to say when I'm talking about public service to people is I say, remember, Dilbert is funny because it's universal. We all have pointy hair bosses that we sometimes run up against. We all have catbird HR directors and things like that. It's universal. And so that again, going back to Federalist Papers number 51, which says, what is government but a reflection of all men? If all men were angels, no government would be necessary. I mean, that's what it is. We need to allow it to be human, but you need to be able to actually implement in that environment that sometimes gets messy, and be able to actually work where someone has a totally different perspective, and you need to understand that perspective. You just can't say that perspective is wrong. You have to understand that narrative and actually work with them and build those bridges. And then the third thing that you need to be able to do is that collaboration piece, and effectively collaborate. And I think the good news is, for millennials and Gen Z coming up, they inherently know they have to collaborate, because they have to do it online. And actually, one of the things that I would recommend to anyone considering a career either in public service or the private sector, if you have not done it yet, join a massively multiplayer online game. Try to form a guild and run a guild of 50 or 60 people online that you've never met before. Because I think just that learning experience of how do you motivate people that you've never met to get things done, and to tackle a problem and learn from it, and handle the fact that maybe you take on whatever the goal is of the game and you initially don't succeed, but you got to rally them again and learn from it. That is a skill that's necessary for the 21st century wherever you are. And then the last thing I would say in closing about public service is, while we may never have an IPO, I'm fond of telling this to the team, we will have what's called a reverse IPO, or an OPI, which is an opportunity for positive impact. The people you'll meet here, they're passionate, they're here for a reason, they find joy in tackling hard problems. And often that's what I say when I first parachute in an organization, is when I meet with people, is what brings you joy. And without a doubt, they will find some reason that they find joy in being of service to the public. And at the end of the day, that's why we're here.
And I want to thank you for joining me today. It's been a great conversation. But more importantly, David, I'd like to thank you for your dedicated service to the country.
Well, thank you, Michael. I've really enjoyed being here. If people are interested, both the FCC blogs, not just my blog, but the chairman's blogs and other blogs are there. And then also I'm on Twitter at FCC_CIO.
This has been the Business of Government Hour, featuring a conversation with David Bray, Chief Information Officer with the Federal Communications Commission. Be sure to join us next week